Okay, everybody, good to see you. Thank you for coming. Special welcome to Finkelsteins from Sharon, old friends of ours. And today's shir is dedicated Refua Shelema to Chaim Aryeh ben Rivka and Emunah Chaiya bat Shlaima Dvorah. And if I could just add a personal note, my wife was recently released from the hospital after a 2-day stay, and I would like to also give the shir to Refua Shelema to Sarah Chanah bat Shayna, and all of these cholim should be have Refua Shelema b'toch shar cholei Yisrael. In addition, an Aliyat Neshama for the father of Daniel Goldstein, Binyamin ben Moshe HaLevi, Love HaShalom, whose Yahrzeit is on Shabbos, the 28th of Tevet. Again, may the Divrei Torah be an aliyah for his neshama. We are, of course, in the Parsha of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and in fact, this is a very exciting Parsha. 7 of the 10 Makos are in this Parsha, and the 10 Makos raise a whole bunch of interesting questions, which I'm actually not going to talk about tonight, about the concept of God hardening Paro's heart, and how do you reconcile that with free will? Those are biggies. Those are big, big questions in Jewish philosophy. And perhaps we will devote some time to that, but that's not what I'm going to talk about this week. So I'll tell you what I'm not going to cover, but things to think about. I want to leave you with things that you can work out on your own. And the famous discussion about how do you reconcile free will with the notion of God hardening Paro's heart. But at the very beginning of the Parsha, there's a very interesting reference when, remember the context, you have to read the Parshiot in continuity, meaning the end of last Parsha segues into this week. And Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu to go to Paro and demand that the Jewish people be released. And Moshe goes to Paro with Aaron. And Paro says, who is this God? I've never heard of this God. Why should I listen to him? And Paro basically said, hey, the Jewish people have too much time on their hands. That's why they're agitating about freedom and liberation. And Paro makes it worse. Paro decrees that instead of just making the bricks, they also have to collect the straw that they add to the bricks, and their quota is not going to be diminished, so life becomes even worse. Moshe Rabbeinu is heartbroken, quite literally heartbroken. He didn't want to go. He argued with God, don't send me, I'm not worthy. Get somebody better, I'm not a good speaker. They're not worthy, I'm not worthy. He made every argument under the sun. According to Chazal, he actually argued with God for 7 days and 7 nights. Finally, God says, you got to go. He has no choice. Moshe goes. And what happens is, things don't get better. Things get worse. And when Moshe walks out of Paro's palace, Dasan and Aviram encounter him and say, who needs you? And Moshe is frankly broken by this. And Moshe says, why have you done bad to your people? I didn't want to go. I didn't think it would be effective, but I didn't think it would be worse. And now it's worse. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives Moshe Rabbeinu Musar, chastisement. He says, when Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov had many disappointments in their life, they didn't question me, they didn't challenge me, they just accepted it. Things don't go your way, and you complain. But you will see that I will take the Jews out of Mitzrayim with the Yad Chazakah, with a strong hand. And that brings us to the beginning of this Parsha. Va'era, I appeared to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and they did not complain. And therefore Hashem says, Lochein, therefore, Emor Livnei Yisrael, say to Bnei Yisrael, I am God, meaning I am the one, Rashi says, that is Ne'eman, that is faithful in keeping his promises. And there are 4 terms of redemption that are used. I will take them out of Mitzrayim. Hotseisi, Hitzalti, I will save them. Viga'alti, I will redeem them. V'lakachti etchem li liyam, and I will take them unto me for a nation. There are 4 lishonot of Geula that are used in this pasuk. V'otzeisi, v'hitzalti, v'go'alti, v'lokachti. Now it's fascinating. We know, of course, that one of the important rituals of the Seder every year is that we have to drink 4 cups of wine. And this wine is drunk at pivotal points in the Seder, after Kiddush, after the Magid, after the narration, after the benching, and after the Hallel. Meaning you recite Kiddush over wine and you drink it, you recite Haggadah over wine and you drink, you recite benching over wine and you drink, you recite Hallel over wine and you drink. So the Mishnah says already that there's a mitzvah of drinking 4 cups of wine at the Seder, and even if a person is getting his support from charity, from tzedakah, we must make an allotment to that person for the 4 cups of wine. That's not a luxury, it's not an optional thing. Even the poorest person is given an allotment for the 4 cups of wine. Now the Talmud Bavli, interestingly enough, does not give a reason for this. The Talmud Bavli does not say why 4 cups of wine. But the Talmud Yerushalmi does give a reason that is very well known to people. It's an amazing thing. You know, the Talmud Yerushalmi is not as widely studied. In fact, many people never studied the Talmud Yerushalmi. And yet, there are certain things in the Talmud Yerushalmi that have become very, very well known. And people don't even realize it's from the Talmud Yerushalmi. And that is the famous idea that when the sages enacted the drinking of the 4 cups of wine, it was to correspond to the 4 expressions of redemption in this Parsha. V'otzeisi, v'hitzalti, v'go'alti, v'lokachti. Right? This is a teaching that even kids in school, 5th grade, are taught, and they should know, therefore, that there's at least one thing in the Talmud Yerushalmi that they've learned. Actually, there's another halacha in the Talmud Yerushalmi that's not in the Bavli as well. A very, very halacha that everybody practices. You know that according to the halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. In fact, the Yisur of eating matzah on Erev Pesach is even earlier than the Yisur of eating chametz on Erev Pesach. I'm allowed to eat bread on Erev Pesach until 4 hours into the day, 4 relative hours. I'm not allowed to eat matzah from the beginning of the day. Now, many people have a minhag. They don't eat matzah from the month of Nisan, or they don't eat matzah from Purim. These are minhagim. But the halacha is you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach, because we want there to be a break so that when you eat the matzah at the Seder, you'll eat it with a certain enthusiasm because you haven't had it for a time. Now, in fact, the Gemara's lashon is, anyone who eats matzah on Erev Pesach is as if he's had intercourse with his betrothed before the chuppah, meaning to say, eventually it'll be good, but not, you're jumping the gun, you're going too early, and that's the comparison to eating matzah on Erev Pesach. So it's interesting, again, just pointing out, that is not in the Babylonian Talmud at all. The Babylonian Talmud makes no reference at all to a prohibition of eating matzah Erev Pesach. It's totally based on the Yerushalmi. So it's a comparatively rare idea that this is from the Yerushalmi. And another thing that's from the Yerushalmi is the idea that the 4 kosos of wine correspond to the 4 lishonos of Geula. Now, in reality, if you look at the pasuk, you'll actually see 5 terms that Hashem uses. Hotzeisi, I will take you out. V'itzalti, I will save you. V'galti, I will redeem you. V'lakachti, I will take you unto me for a nation. But then it says, V'hevesi eschem el haaretz, I will bring you to Eretz Yisrael. V'hevesi. There are 5 lishonos of redemption. So why don't we have 5 cups of wine? In point of fact, there is a man da'amar in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, in the Brisa, Rabbi Tarfon, who actually says you're supposed to have 5 cups because of Hevesi. And at least the Maharal, as well as some other authorities, actually say that although we don't paskin that 5 cups are mandatory, but a 5th cup is considered to be a desirable hidur mitzvah. It's not widely practiced, but there are certain chassidim that actually drink 5 cups. And then you get into an enormously complicated problem, which I'm not going to get into because it's enormously complicated. Where do you put the fifth cup? That's not so easy exactly where you would position it. And there are around 15 different views as where you put the fifth cup if you have the fifth cup. But I think for most of us, I think 4 cups knocks us out sufficiently that we're not really ready for anything more. But the question is, why wouldn't we have a fifth cup if the Hevesi is a lashon of Geula? So the Meforshim explain that the reference, I will bring you to the land, is not a reference to the Jewish people in the days of Yoshua, but it's a reference to the ultimate messianic redemption that hasn't yet come. So the 4 Lashonos of Geula are the redemption that God already gave us. The 5th is the Geula of Mashiach. And indeed, that is the source of Elijah's cup. The kos of Eliyahu, right? There's a cup at the Seder that we pour, and we don't drink. And we say it's for Eliyahu HaNavi. Why do I bring in Eliyahu HaNavi? For a very simple reason. Eliyahu HaNavi is the one that's going to announce the coming of Mashiach. So essentially what we're saying is, this is the cup that we're holding for Eliyahu, and Eliyahu HaNavi comes, then we're going to drink it. Generations of parents tell their kids they should watch the cup carefully because they will see it go down a little bit as the invisible Eliyahu drinks it, and sometimes the father will jostle the table and some of the wine will fall. But again, as far as I know, there is a medrash that says Eliyahu HaNavi visits every Seder. There actually is a medrash. When you open the door, Eliyahu HaNavi comes in. But as far as I know, there's no makar in Chazal that he actually takes a sip of the wine. That already is a little bit of an augmentation of the legend. In fact, I remember reading, it was an extraordinarily moving, powerful thing. A woman actually became a very, very prominent teacher, but she wrote a memoir of living through the Holocaust. And she wrote about, it was Pearl Benish, and she wrote about the last Seder she had with her parents in 1939 before the Nazis came and took them away. Actually, maybe in 1940, meaning to say the ghettos were created already, but this was the last time before they were forcibly taken to the camps. And when your father opened the door, she says, he was so sure Eliyahu HaNavi would come. He was so sure. And when he opened the door and like nothing happened, so to speak, he broke down crying. Just how powerful the yearning for Geula was in that particular moment. But okay. Be it as it may, though, the question becomes, since Yetziat Mitzrayim was a unitary event, it was only one event, God took us out of Mitzrayim, why is it described as 4 Lashonos of Geula? Why are there 4 terms of redemption to describe a single event called Yetzias Mitzrayim? So the Netziv offers a very interesting explanation, which is a bit technical, in which he says that the Jewish people were released from Mitzrayim in gradual stages over a year, meaning the whole duration of the 10 plagues was 12 months. And he says, and he proves it from looking at the different responses after each group of Makos. So it mentions Paro didn't listen, but it describes Paro not listening in different ways. So the Netziv says that at various points, Paro released them from hard labor, but they still were slaves. Right? So the first liberation occurred, released from hard labor, but you're still in servitude. The second liberation is you're released from servitude, but you're not allowed to leave the country. The third liberation, which is Pesach time, means you can leave the country. And the fourth liberation is getting the Torah. I took you unto me for a nation. So the Netziv sees the liberation of Egypt as occurring in 4 discrete stages over that year period. Release from extreme hard servitude to plain slavery. Release from slavery to freedom, but not permitted to leave the country. Permitted to leave the country. And fourth stage is receiving the Torah. So the Netziv says there are 4 Lashonos of Geula because the freedom of the Jewish people took place in 4 stages. But the Meshech Chachma of Meir Simcha Cohen offers a different explanation. And he says the following. He says that the reason why there are 4 Lashonos of Geula is because there were 4 dangers that an enslaved population faces for which they had to be redeemed. 4 sakanos. Sakana number 1 that the Jewish people faced was spiritual survival. After all, they're in the middle of this perverse, corrupt, degenerate culture. And Chazal tell us that the Jewish people were adversely affected. They should have been in Mitzrayim 400 years. And instead, God took them out after 210 years because they were at the 49th level of impurity. And they were sinking fast. The amount of time it would take for their dough to become chametz, they would have hit level 50. We don't even know what that means. They would have been irredeemable. God had to take them out in haste. And they all worshipped idols other than the tribe of Levi. They did not practice bris milah, circumcision, other than the tribe of Levi. So the truth of the matter is, the first, most greatest danger that a Jew faces in this persecuted environment is that they lose their sense of how to connect to God. They lose their religion, they lose their values, they lose their morality. They lose their sense of ethics. So they needed to be saved from that danger. The second danger was the danger to their physical survival. Now, obviously, the Jewish people were threatened in a variety of ways. On some level, there was direct genocide, like the Holocaust, in which Paro wanted the boys to be thrown into the Nile and the like. But other than that, even if all you have are labor camps, all you have is hard slavery, people die of the work, they die of the diseases, again, comparable to the Holocaust itself. They die of inadequate food, right? So threat number 1 is spiritual assimilation. Threat number 2 is jeopardy of their physical survival. Threat number 3 is a bit more subtle. And Rabbi Simcha says, one of the great, great detriments of slavery is you lose a sense of history. You lose a sense of where you come from. Now, those who are older in the audience, you may remember the phenomenon of roots. Alex Haley was a black author, scholar, and he wrote a book about the black experience coming from Africa to the United States. Although I heard later some of his account was not personally true, meaning he made certain claims about his own personal background that was not emes, but whatever it is, the overall story was very much true. And he pointed out that many of those who later became slaves in the United States, they came from nobility, they came from royalty. They had great figures in their background. But that was simply erased from their memory, erased from their consciousness. Their children had no sense from where they were coming. Their children had no sense that they came from nobility. They came from people of accomplishment, people of greatness in whatever particular area that greatness was manifest. A slave has no sense of a historical identity. They are menutak. First of all, they're often separated from their parents. Separated, families are separate. You don't know who your father is, you don't know who your mother is, etc. So, sakana number 3, the Meshech Chochmah says, is that a slave can lack a sense of history, a lack of where he came from. And as the old saying goes, if you don't know where you came from, you can't really have a sense of where you need to be going. I need that sense of a past in order to give me some type of vision for my future. The 4th sakana is lack of hope. That after a while, a person gets so broken in spirit that they can no longer even envision, they can no longer even imagine any potential for improvement. You just give up. The importance of hope in life is even true in a physical medical context. There is at least anecdotal research. I'm not sure if they have absolutely scientifically valid studies, that when people give up hope that they'll have any chance of recovery, the body itself starts shutting down in irreversible ways. People who believe in voodoo, right? There are people who believe that if somebody sticks a pin in their effigy, they're going to drop dead. Now, of course, voodoo is garbage, no such thing. But if you believe it, you'll get a heart attack when somebody does it. The interesting question is, would it work even if you weren't aware that somebody was doing it? There's no logic to that. But at least if you're aware of it and you believe it, your body gets affected. So one of the greatest dangers in life is when you lose hope that things can ever get better. So the Meshech Chochmah says, very simply, that the reason why there are 4 Lishonot of Geula is because there were 4 sakanot, 4 dangers, from which the Jewish people had to be redeemed. They had to be redeemed from spiritual assimilation. They had to be redeemed from physical jeopardy. They had to be redeemed from a lack of a sense of history. And they had to be redeemed from the danger of a lack of hope. 4 Lishonot of Geula, because there are 4 sakanot that a slave faces. But now, he takes the analysis a little further. I actually mentioned this either last week or the week before, I don't remember, that there are a number of midrashim that make the point, the Gemara says, well, that although the Jewish people were in the 49th level of impurity, and they were not really deserving of redemption, there were 4 zechuyot, there were 4 merits that enabled them to be redeemed. And exactly what the 4 is, every medrash says 4, but the 4 are not always the same. A few of them are constant, some of them are different. I'm going to use, or the Meshech Chochmah uses, the list of 4 that appears in the Mechilta, which is the medrash on Shemos. And it says there were 4 merits which enabled the Jewish people to be redeemed. Merit number 1 is they did not intermarry. Now, one could make the argument, well, how would they intermarry? They were slaves to the Egyptians. I mean, what Egyptian is going to take them, for this? But nevertheless, there were Egyptians that were slaves as well. And even in Nazi Germany, even in Nazi Europe, I mean, there were times when they wouldn't have a marriage, so to speak, but there were times when a Nazi would want to sexually abuse a Jewish woman. And there's no question that Egyptians would do the same thing. And yet Chazal say that women were faithful to their husbands, even at great personal risk. And it was that faithfulness to the marital bond that was a great, great zechut that enabled them to be redeemed. That's zechut number 1. Zechut number 2 is they did not speak Lashon Hara against each other. They did not engage in derogatory speech. Now, let me explain exactly what this means, because people misunderstand it sometimes. When it says they did not speak Lashon Hara against each other, that doesn't mean they were learning the Chafetz Chaim's rules and they were careful. It really refers to a different type of phenomenon, and that is, they didn't turn against each other by being informers to the authorities in order to get temporary advantages. Meaning, vis-a-vis each other, I don't know, maybe they were gossiping. And indeed, people ask the question, because we find that when Moshe Rabbeinu, as how could Chazal say they didn't speak Lashon Hara? When Moshe Rabbeinu killed the Egyptian, and Dasan V'Aviram say, and then the next, right? So So later, Dustin Miriam says, when they're fighting, right, they're hitting, so one says, oh, are you going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? So Rashi says, Moshe said, oh, now that I know they speak Lashon Hara, I don't know if they're worthy of being redeemed. So they did speak Lashon Hara. But when Chazal say they didn't speak Lashon Hara, it's a different idea. It's not the from, I don't speak Lashon Hara. It's, we have a united front as slaves. We're not going to turn against each other to get some advantage. You know, among the superimposed on the enormous tragedies of the Holocaust was another level of tragedy, in which sometimes, out of extreme need, there were Jews who would turn against other Jews to get a little more food, a little more medicine, some improvement of living conditions. You know, we're not in a position necessarily to judge. In fact, I read a story, an amazing story, that a man was walking, this was around 20 years ago. A man is walking with his grandson. I think it was here in Eretz Yisrael somewhere. And he sees another elderly man in the distance. And he says to his grandson, this is just unbelievable. He says to his grandson, that was my best friend when we were growing up. And I haven't seen him in 50 years. But he made no effort to go to him. So the grandson said, what do you mean, your best friend? You haven't seen him in 50 years? Let's go. He said, no, I really don't want to talk to him. But so the grandson keeps saying, he's your best friend. You didn't see him in 50 years. You don't want to talk to him? How is it possible? So the grandfather said, I'd rather not say, but eventually he broke down. And the story basically was that 50 years before, he had hidden papers to get out of Europe for his wife and children. And he happened to mention to the man where he was concealing the papers. And when it was time for him to leave, the papers were not there. The man had taken them for his own family. And the man who had the papers lost his first wife and children. So he felt he couldn't really talk to this man again. But then the grandson says, so go and punch him in the face, go kill him. So he said to his grandson, you don't understand how desperate people were. You don't understand how scared people were. I can't talk to him because of what happened to me, but I don't hate him. People just acted that way because they were crazy. They were crazy with grief and crazy with suffering and crazy with fear. So, again, I can't interact with him. I'm not going to judge him either. That's what he said. Okay, this is almost beyond human capacity. But be it as it may, therefore, when Chazal say they didn't speak Lashon Hara, what that really means is they didn't turn against each other to get advantages. We are united in this struggle. Now, the third merit that the Mechilta mentions is they kept their Jewish names. They didn't use Egyptian names. And the fourth zechus that it mentions is they continued to speak the Hebrew language. So again, B'kitzur, the four merits of which the Jews left Mitzrayim, according to the Mechilta, is they didn't intermarry, they didn't speak Lashon Hara, they didn't change their names, they didn't change their language. Now there are other things that also talk about Jewish clothing and the like, but let's go with he's going with the Mechilta. So here is the very ingenious correlation that the Meshech Chochmah makes. The Meshech Chochmah says that when you face danger of any kind and you need God to redeem you, there must be some behavior on your part that addresses the danger, that will bring down the divine blessing that will protect you. This is called in the language of Kabbalah, in order for there to be Isarusa de Le'ela. Isarusa de Le'ela is Aramaic, an awakening from above, meaning God brings down something. It must start with Isarusa de Latata, an awakening mitachat, an awakening from below. And Arusa de Le'ela requires Isarusa de Latata. So, if there are 4 dangers, there has to be something we're doing to counter those 4 dangers. And only then do we merit Hashem's redemption. So the Meshech Chochmah is going to correlate the 4 merits to the 4 dangers. And this is how he sets it up. Danger number 1 was spiritual assimilation, a loss of your values, a loss of your ethics, a loss of your sense of what is holy in life. What behavior did the Jewish people have that shielded them from being destroyed in that way? The faithfulness of the marital bond. Because it's true that the Jewish people were idol worshippers. The Jewish people had abandoned many, many things. But the one thing that they maintained was the sacred bond of husband and wife. What do Chazal say? When Ish ve'isha live in Shalom, the Shekhinah is with them. That preserve whatever little spark of, remember, they're 49th level of Tumah, so they're not so great. But the little spark of holiness that was preserved was the holiness in the relationship of husband and wife. And that was the spark that prevented the total spiritual assimilation, which then brought God down to redeem them from that. Now, the second sakana was danger to physical survival. That was countered by the united front of not speaking Lashon Hara. I don't mean this in the spiritual sense that in the merit of Lashon Hara God will protect you. That happens to be true as well. But that's not the dynamic. The dynamic is different. That when we are physically threatened, what will keep us safe is the unity of not giving in, not abandoning your fellow person. Right? The famous remark, united we stand, divided we fall. Or as I believe Benjamin Franklin put it, we must all, at the time of the revolution, we must all hang together or we will surely hang separately. And therefore, what protects us from physical annihilation is unity. You know, every few years, newspapers in Israel run surveys regarding what are the biggest problems that Jews in Israel face. And they try to get answers from religious, non-religious, secular, all types of people. And, you know, unfortunately, there are quite a few things that can make the list, whether you're talking about Islamic terrorism, whether you're talking about nuclear war, you know, whether you're talking about the cost of housing or even the cost of cottage cheese or shortage of butter. You know, we have all sorts of different issues here. But the water is a perennial issue. But the issue that is always number one in these surveys, given by the most respondents, whether it's religious, secular, Charedi, Dati Leumi, Chiloni, whatever it is the lack of unity among the Jewish people. Call it Sinat Chinam or whatever you want to call it. Our ability, our apparently inexhaustible ability to fight over everything just never ends. And it's understood by everybody that when there's achdus among the Jewish people, we're protected against enemies who try to destroy us. And when there's a lack of achdus, we're weak and we're vulnerable. So if faithfulness to the marriage bond is what protected us spiritually, it's the not speaking Lashon Hara, which means not turning against each other for temporary advantages. That preserves us spiritually. Preserves us physically. Right, physically, right? So the marriage is spiritual and the not speaking Lashon Hara is physical. We then come to the third sakana. The third sakana was a slave lacks a sense of history. Where do I come from? I come from nowhere. Well, the antidote to that is not changing your names. Because, again, this is a little bit anachronistic, but the Meshech Chacham points out that it was common in Klal Yisrael that you name people after ancestors. Again, Sephardim do it even if someone is alive. Ashkenazim do it only after someone's dead. But a child is named after a bubby, a grandmother, a grandfather. Every moment of their lives, they recognize that they have a past. They have a yichus. If the little boy is called Avram, he's either named after his grandfather or uncle or something, or named after Avram Avinu. Comes from the others. You know, even the Yiddish diminutives. You call somebody Bubala, Tatola, Zedala. Sometimes people just use them indiscriminately. They don't even know what they mean. But you know, quite literally, Bubala, little grandmother. Zedala, little grandfather. Tatola, little father. Mamala. What does that tell a child? You're connected to those earlier generations. You don't come from nothing. You come from goodness. You come from Kedusha. You come from something to be proud of. And if someone says, well, what if I'm a ger? What if I'm a non-Jew who converted? I don't come from Judaism. Well, the answer is number one. Even a ger can rightfully take pride in the family they came from. Even of non-Jewish origin. Gave them values, gave them strength. And second of all, a person who becomes a ger is Avram's family. Because you're a family of Ben Avram and Sarah. You're Avram's family because you follow Avram's teaching. So the pride of being connected to that past belongs to everybody who embraces that past. Not just biological descendants. So not changing the names connects you to your history. And then we have the final point. Lack of hope. So the Meshech Chachma says, that's addressed by continuing to speak the language, Hebrew. Now you know that for a number of centuries, Latin was the most spoken language in the world. Latin was the language of the Roman Empire that dominated virtually all of the known world at the time. Today, Latin is more or less a dead language, even within the Catholic Church, which were the last holdouts. The Catholic Church no longer requires that Mass be given in Latin. Of course, there are some ultra-Orthodox Catholics, some Haredi Catholics, that claim that the reforms of Vatican II were reforms, and they consider the Pope to be a reformed Pope, and whatever it would be, and they still conduct the Mass in Latin. But I think they're excommunicated. They're actually put in Chaim by the Catholic Church for rejecting official Catholic teachings. Latin survives a little bit in high school honors courses, and people who want to read classics, may take Latin. And of course, even in law, we have Latin expressions here and there, and in medicine as well. Some prescription abbreviations are technically Latin. But Latin is a dead language, and there are many, many dead languages, much more dead than Latin. You have Assyrian, you have Hittite. And you can go to a university library, you can find Dictionary of Assyrian. But not too many people speak it, because if a language no longer represents a living culture, it more or less becomes extinct. So think about this. I'm living in Egypt. If I truly believe there is no hope that we're ever going to be redeemed, why would I bother to speak to my child in Hebrew? So what's the message I'm giving to my child when I speak to him in Hebrew? It's the message of hope. We're not going to be here forever. There's going to come a time, I don't know if it's in my life or your life, but there's going to come a time that God is going to take us out of here. And we're going to have our land. and we will need our language. So we are preserving this language. Now remember, let me just make an obvious point. Remember that this is before Moshe Rabbeinu came, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu was only there for 1 year. I mean, he grew up in Mitzrayim, but then he went to Midian. So for most of these years, there was no Moshe Rabbeinu there. So when we talk about this hope that was preserved, this is the hope before the plagues, before Moshe came. When things looked hopeless. But they preserved it. Do you see how keeping the language means we have hope? We're not giving up. It doesn't mean it'll be tomorrow. But it will be. And therefore we need to keep our language intact. That's why, the so-called father of modern Hebrew, interesting man, Eliezer ben Yehuda. His name was Eliezer Perlman, but he became Eliezer ben Yehuda. And to this very day, he's a very, very controversial person, at least in the religious world, because he happened to be not only not religious, but kind of anti-religious in many, many ways. But he was a fanatic in one area. He was truly, truly fanatic in revival, almost single-handedly, reviving the modern language of Hebrew, including inventing new words and dictionaries and everything else. In fact, his dictionary is very, very fascinating. It's kind of out of print, but he really went into etymologies, and he created words like for camera, matzlama. I mean, these are words he invented, more or less. Computer, machshav, he didn't invent because there were no machshavs then, but matzlama, many, many words. But you see how he did it, because the word tselem is a biblical Hebrew word for image. Matzlama, that which takes images and the like. So he was really, really fanatic for the Hebrew language. And some people felt that the Hebrew language should only be used for holy matters, it shouldn't be used for daily speech. And yet you see from this chazal that one of the zechuyos of Am Yisrael was that they continued to speak Lashon HaKodesh. So for that he deserves a lot of credit. There is a story they tell, and I will say outright from the start, that some question the veracity of the stories. I don't want emails about the story is false. I'm aware that some say the story is false, but I will tell you the story anyway, because I have a weakness. Whenever it's a good story, I like to say it, even if it's not true. So I'm going to say it because I think it makes a point, even if it's historically not accurate. The story goes, Eliezer ben Yehuda most of the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim did not speak to him. They did not want anything to do with him. The one rabbi who spoke to him, as you would probably guess, was Rav Kook. And every Friday, he would go to Rav Kook, and he would ask Rav Kook the meaning of certain terms in the Talmud and the Medrash, so he could somehow modernize them and incorporate them into the Hebrew language. So he was not learning the Talmud for the religious meanings of the Talmud, but for the linguistic meanings. So he would go to Rav Kook, and Rav Kook would explain to him what all these words mean. And one time, at the end of a session, Rav Kook said to him in Ivrit, not Yiddish, Eliezer, ulai hazman higia lasot tshuva. Perhaps the time has come to do tshuva and come back to the Torah. And Eliezer ben Yehuda responded, ulai harav tzodek. Perhaps the Rav is correct. He goes home. That night or the night afterwards, he died suddenly. And the funeral, as the Minhag Yerushalayim, they do it right away. They did the funeral Motzei Shabbat, middle of the night. And the story goes, this is the part that maybe people would contest. Rav Kook was the only Rav who came to the funeral. And Rav Kook gave a hesped. And Rav Kook said, he is convinced Eliezer ben Yehuda died a Baal Tshuva, and the Rambam says, even if a person does Tshuva 1 minute before his death, all of his sins are forgiven, and he goes to Gan Eden, and therefore he said he would regard Eliezer ben Yehuda as a tzaddik. Okay, a nice story, and whether it's absolutely true or not, I don't know, but I think it exemplifies Rav Kook's general attitude towards people who may not have been keeping all the mitzvot, but still contributed something to Klal Yisrael. So again, you see the Meshech Chacham's correlation. Again, the correlation is a little bit complicated. There are 4 Lashonos of Geula because there are 4 dangers that the Jewish people faced. Spiritual assimilation, physical destruction, loss of history, loss of hope. The 4 dangers were countermanded by 4 merits on our part that address those dangers. Spiritual assimilation, countered by the faithfulness of husband and wives to each other. Physical jeopardy, countered by not speaking Lashon Hara. Lack of history, countered by names, the Jewish names. And lack of hope, countered by speaking Lashon HaKodesh, which is an affirmation of hope. So we merited the 4 redemptions from the 4 dangers because of the 4 behaviors on our part. So now there's a 4th correlation, right? So we have 4 correlations of 4, and that is the placement of the 4 kosos in the context of the Seder. The first cup is the cup of Kiddush, right? The second cup is the cup of Magid. Magid is the narration of the Haggadah. The third cup is the cup of Birkat HaMazon, benching. And the 4th cup is the cup of Challah. So here's how the Meshech Chachma correlates them. The cup of Kiddush, sanctification, corresponds to God liberating us from spiritual assimilation through the relationship of husband and wife that actually goes by the term Kiddushin, sanctification. So the first cup is a celebration of the sanctity of the Jewish home, which liberated us from spiritual danger. Now the second cup is the cup of Magid. Now here we're changing the order a little bit. Now what is Magid? Magid is essentially the historical narrative of the Haggadah. That corresponds to the sense of history. The sense that we come from the Avos, we come from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and remembering the glorious history that God has given us and done for us. So that corresponds to what gives us a sense of history. In other words, not changing the names, but history is building on that idea of knowing where you're coming from. Right, so this is taking it a little out of order. The third cup, Birkat HaMazon. Now, Birkat HaMazon corresponds to the unity of not speaking Lashon Hara. Now, why is that so? So let's think about this. Birkat HaMazon, above all, is an exercise in Hakaras HaTov, gratitude. Right? That's what benching is. I express my gratitude to God. A very key component of gratitude is to be sameach b'chelko, to appreciate what you have. Right? What do Chazal say? Ezehu Asher, who is a wealthy person? Hasameach b'chelko, a person who rejoices in whatever he has. I still remember many, many years ago when I was first came to Jerusalem on a trip. I was not living here yet. So I saw 4 kids walking on the street in a poor neighborhood, and they were sharing a popsicle, one popsicle between all 4 of them. And they were having the greatest time. They were laughing and a lick, another lick, not the most hygienic thing perhaps, but they were having the time of their lives. One popsicle going back and forth with 4 kids. Then you think about, kids that have all these luxuries. They don't have the most recent iPhone or a Game Boy, a Game Box. I don't even know the names of all of these different types of games. But they're not happy because it's not the most recent version. So who is wealthier? Ezehu Asher. Sameach b'chelko. We see this in our lives all the time. This is a chazal that is so evident from the experience of life itself. You don't even have to prove it in any particular way. So Birkat HaMazon is about gratitude. Birkat HaMazon is about sameach b'chelko. When you're sameach b'chelko, you're not jealous. When you're not jealous, there's unity. When there's unity, you're not going to speak Lashon Hara. You're not going to turn against each other. So therefore, Birkat HaMazon corresponds to the merit of not speaking Lashon Hara, which protected us physically. So this is out of order a little bit in that way. Now, the final one, the final cup is on Hallel. Now here is a very interesting thing about the Hallel of the Seder that I'm sure you've noticed over the years. The Hallel of the Seder is a very unusual Hallel. It's unusual in a lot of ways. We say it's sitting down, which you normally don't do, etc. But one of the most unusual features is it is split in two unequal halves. The first two chapters of Hallel are recited at the end of Magid before the second cup, before the meal. The rest of Hallel is recited after the meal when you open the door to Eliyahu Hanavi. Hallel is split. Why is Hallel split? So the commentaries tell us, because the first part of Hallel is thanking God for the past, that he took us out of Mitzrayim. That's why it concludes the Magid. The Magid is the story of the Exodus. We conclude with praising God for the Exodus. But the post-meal Hallel is no longer focusing on Yetziat Mitzrayim. It is looking to the future messianic redemption. There is something messianic. That's why it comes after opening the door for Eliyahu Hanavi. In a way, the Hallel after the Seder is not always given its proper due. People are very tired. In fact, people who are not conversant with halacha, even among the Orthodox, they sometimes just leave. They figure after benching, after Afikoman, I'll leave. And there are problems, because number one, the Hallel after the Seder, you've already drunk 3 cups. Number 2, you're not allowed to talk, so you can't even say Divrei Torah, etc. You're not allowed to be mafsek. But the truth is, there is something very elevating, very holy, because we kind of finished about the Exodus, and our eyes are looking towards the future. So what is that? Hope. The idea that things are going to get better, things are going to change. So you see how all of these correlations come together in a very intricate way. 4 lashonot of Geula, because of 4 dangers. But the 4 dangers are met by 4 zechuyos on our part. And the 4 zechuyos on our part correspond to their placement in the Seder itself. First cup, the spiritual zechus of the sanctification of marriage. Second cup, connection to the past. Third cup, the unity of community, because there's no jealousy, Birkat HaMazon. And the fourth cup, the expression of hope in Mashiach, right? And this is kind of how the Meshech Chochmah draws together the meaning of the 4 cups on all of these different levels. Now it's interesting, people say, the Jews in Mitzrayim were so bad. They were in the 49th level of Tumah. 4/5 of them actually died. The 1/5 was on the 49th level of Tumah. But here's the thing. They had these 4 merits. Let's ask ourselves about the Jewish world generally. How many of those 4 merits are actually present? They were faithful in their marriages. They didn't intermarry. Well, at Sarah, the intermarriage rate in the United States, in some places, is as high as 7 in 10. You know what that means? That means 7 out of 10 marriages in which somebody is a Jew, the other party will not be a Jew. 7 out of 10. Intermarriage. Sometimes parents call up, their child is engaged to a guy, and how do you stop it? Well, the truth is, without a religious commitment, it is almost impossible to make a secular argument against intermarriage. I mean, why shouldn't your child intermarry? Are you a racist? I mean, what are you going to say? If you have Torah beliefs, then you can come up with different arguments. But a secular argument not to intermarry is a very, very hard thing to do. And the truth is, I have to say, though, that what's even more painful is that even among the Orthodox community, even among the Orthodox world, I'm not going to call it an epidemic. It's not 7 out of 10, obviously. But there is a not insubstantial situation of even religious kids who are raised to be Shomer Shabbos, intermarry. So we're pretty weak on that one. Then the second merit of not speaking Lashon Hara. Once again, with all of our Sinat Chinam, we keep on going back and forth against each other. And then the third, sense of history. How many people don't have a sense of where they're coming from? A person I know in Baltimore who's a law professor, I think now he's retired, he once told me that he had a student go over to him. This person is conspicuously, although he teaches in a secular law school, he has a long beard, he looks obviously very, very frum. So a student went over to him and said, hey, you look like a rabbi. I want you, did you ever hear of this Rabbi Elijah of Vilna? I'm told he was a pretty famous rabbi, the Vilna Gaon. And the kid said, I'm a direct great-great-grandson. But he didn't even know who the Vilna Gaon was. Talk about not being connected to the glories of your past. And lack of hope. How much do we yearn for Mashiach? How much do we may believe it intellectually, but in a real existential sense, it's not really part of our lives. So it's a funny thing when we look down at the Jews in Egypt and we say, oh, they're in the 49th level of Tumah. We might be 49.5. We might be 50. We might be 52. You'll ask me a question. Isn't it true that if you hit 50, you're irredeemable? So we got to be better than that? Not necessarily, because Rav Chaim Volozhner has an interesting cloud. He says the rule that if you hit level 50, you're irredeemable is only before Hashem gave the Torah to the Jewish people. Once he gave the Torah, even if you hit 50, you're going to be okay. Well, that's good news and that's bad news. The good news is, even if you hit 50, you're okay. The bad news is, we can no longer assume we didn't hit 50. All the time we were assuming we didn't hit 50 because otherwise we wouldn't be redeemable. The answer is no. We could hit 55, we could be at 60. And Baruch Hashem, we'll still have the chance at being redeemed. So there are a lot of challenges here. And as I indicated the other week, forgive me for repeating a little bit, these 4 merits of the Jewish people are not really religious merits. They're not frumkeit merits. They're achdus merits. Being faithful to your spouse, not turning against your fellow Jew, holding on to your Jewish name, holding on to your Jewish language. We could call this pejoratively ethnic Judaism. This was not out of spiritual values. They were worshiping Avodah Zarah. How spiritual could they be? But you see that identifying as part of Klal Yisrael is not the end-all of Judaism, but it's the beginning of it. And without that, there can be no hope. I think I mentioned more than once my encounter in Chicago many years ago on Devon Avenue. It's probably still there. There was a kosher-style restaurant called The Bagel. Kosher-style, meaning treif restaurant. And I remember walking by in a windy Chicago winter day, and I saw a sign in the restaurant window on Saturday that we offer a free glass of wine with every order of cholent. So I was thinking to myself at the time, this is everything that's wrong with American gastronomic Judaism. Non-kosher wine with non-kosher cholent made on Shabbos that you come in and you pay money. And this is somehow supposed to be Shabbos, right? The person remembers that his grandmother made something called cholent and had Manischewitz wine, so I'm going to go in and do the same thing, and that way I'm going to have a Shabbos experience. How trivial, right? How foolish. But then as I get older, hopefully wiser, I don't know, but certainly older, I think to myself that there is some value in this. The person has a stirring, the person has a feeling. I want to connect to the Jewish people. I don't know how, I don't know what. I'm not ready to change my life. But I want to connect a little bit. That's exactly what the Jews in Mitzrayim were facing. It's like a guy, a guy's in a, I don't know if they have discotheques today, but let's say a guy goes with a Rafi, he's in a discotheque, his shirt is open to his navel, and he wears a Jewish Magen David. So I'm supposed to say, oh, what a great guy, he speaks Hebrew, and he keeps a Hebrew name, etc. But, what is that? The answer is, it is something. He is publicly proclaiming, you are my people. I'm with you. You're my group. That counts for something. People go over you in an airport, and they sometimes whisper conspiratorially, I'm a member of the tribe, whatever it would be. And it happens all the time. If you're conspicuously religious Jew, they know you're Jewish, people will often come out of the woodwork. Now I have to admit, sometimes it irritates me because I'm busy, whatever it is. I just don't want some guy, hey, I'm Jewish too, okay. But it's wrong that it irritates me, because it shouldn't irritate me. A person that says, you're my people, is connecting to Am Yisrael. And that connection is the shorish, is the root of redemption. Now, it's not the end. You may remember from the 1970s when every synagogue, conservative, Reform, Orthodox, were agitating for the liberation of the Jews of the Soviet Union. So they all had a big sign on the Shul parking lot or on the grass, let my people go. Now the problem is, that is taken from the Parsha, Shalach ami, send my people. But they always leave out the last word, Shalach ami veyavduni, send my people so they will serve me. It's not just let my people go. There's a purpose. So yeah, freedom is so we will serve Hashem, for sure. So it's not the end all, but the identification with the Jewish people is the beginning. And without that beginning, there can be no ending. So as I said last week, in these Parshios of Yetziat Mitzrayim, we should think about how we can achieve that type of state in our own lives. And in that way be zocha to the Geula Shlaima that should be b'mehera v'yameinu.
Amen.
It's